Okay, here we go. So the first lesson in the character moments workshop is hero fantasy. So before we get into hero fantasy a little bit more, I'd like to backtrack just a little bit and go over what I mean by character moments. I know I went over it pretty generally in the introduction, but I'd like to go just a little bit more in depth. Okay, so what exactly is a hero fantasy? Well, I basically very generally boiled down a hero fantasy into two things: who the character is and what the character does. So, particularly speaking, their personality, so who they are outside of the game, right? So, if we think about Tracer, Tracer is a very bubbly and bright and optimistic character, right? And on the other side of the personality, their gameplay. So what they do inside of the game, right? And if we're continuing along the example of Tracer, she is very quick. She has a dash that can borderline teleport her. She has an ability that can recall her through time. And so, like, their gameplay has this kind of theme of somewhat like a time travel, you know? And so, like, two of these things together, their personality and their gameplay, who they are outside of the game and who what they do inside of the game, kind of summarizes and basically makes up what their hero fantasy is. And so that's something that we're going to be trying to capture in almost all character moments. There are times at which the purpose of the character moment isn't necessarily to capture the hero fantasy, but generally speaking, more often than not, there needs to be at least a little bit of evidence into the hero fantasy. Because if you think about it, let's say, for example, we're doing a character moment that is not necessarily in service of gameplay or not necessarily in service of like the game in itself. Let's say the purpose is to tell a story. And so their personality and who they are will still affect and influence the acting choices and the animation choices that you make. What do I mean by a character moment? And by the way, this term character moment is something that I've coined personally for this workshop. This is in no way, shape, or form a universal term or like an industry term. This is just what I'm calling it for this workshop. So, what do I mean by character moment? I mean places outside of gameplay where you view or interact with the character. Now, there are different kinds of character moments, and all of them you'll find in different places of the game. They serve different purposes, and they all differ per game. So, some games may have some of these things, some games may not, right? And so, a good example for one is a hero select. So, when I talk about like a hero select, what I mean is basically the screen where you queue into, let's say, a game, um, and whether it's like a fighting game, you can think of like the hero select screen of when you're choosing your character, like in a Street Fighter, like hero select screen, or let's say, for example, like a PvP hero shooter like Overwatch, where you're basically queued into your game and you select on your hero and you see an animation of the character that you've chosen come up. A character intro. These are relatively new. I guess relative based off how old you are. Maybe I just dated myself, but character intros are pretty common these days in that they're basically a moment in gameplay, or sorry, they're a moment leading up to or out of some kind of a highlight of gameplay. And it happens either pre-match or pre, let's say, a highlight recording or anything like that. An emote. So this one fires off directly in gameplay. But again, this isn't gameplay itself because um, it technically runs like in the middle of gameplay or during a game, but it has no repercussion or no consequence against you or the other team, right? You're unable to interact with one another. A real time cutscene, an RTC. So you can think of these kind of like when you're playing in a game, whether it's like I think a more pertinent example of this would be some kind of like an action RPG game that's third person, and a cutscene plays, and they've become a lot more interactive over time. So a good example of this would be like God of War. They do real time cutscenes like the best, right? They're amazing at it. And so whenever there's a cutscene that runs real time in gameplay, that's what RTC means. An in-game cinematic. So this is a little bit different, right? A cinematic is obviously somewhere that you would probably watch out of gameplay entirely. Possibly you watch it as a trailer or like um, some kind of like linear media outside of the game. But the big difference being is that it's still being captured and rendered out of the engine. So there's a big difference between an in-game cinematic and this final example being a pre-rendered cinematic. So a pre-rendered cinematic meaning it doesn't use anything from the engine at all. It's pre-rendered a lot like um like a like a modern game cinematic is like an announcement trailer, or it's a lot closer to the workflow and like the pipeline of a film or VFX or an episodic, something like that. Okay, so why a character moment? I'm basically using this to kind of differentiate the differences between each kind of character moment, right? So each character moment will serve a unique purpose and have a different set of restrictions, right? So it could be a number of things, right? Like the relation to the camera, the rig that you're using, how you should animate it, whether you're animating in Maya, whether you're animating in Engine or some other DCC, right? There's all kinds of restrictions at each of these, and it's important to know the differences between all of the different ones. And so, out of the examples that I've shown or that we've talked about, I'll kind of talk about some of the differences between the two, or between all of them. Sorry, because it's important to know these going into it. So, let's say for example, a hero select, right? The purpose is to sell the hero fantasy and/or promise of the character in the game, right? So if you can think of um, some of the more modern hero selects, right, where maybe it's in Mortal Kombat or sometimes in Overwatch, let's say like maybe in a Tekken game or a fighting game or something like that. More often than not, you'll get some kind of a performance out of the character that's either um, deeply steeped in the hero fantasy. So, meaning there's some kind of promise as to what you could expect from them in game. Like they'd be using one of their abilities that you can use in the game or something like that. Or they'll do some kind of performance based off of their personality. So, something that's very in character with their backstory and who they are as a character, and not just who you'd be piloting in the game, right? Character intro, and I had mentioned this before. The purpose of this is to show off the character in a dynamic moment. So a good example of this would be um, a moment in which you can envision yourself being the character in like the heat of battle or in the middle of gameplay, and there's a moment that makes you feel like really badass. You know what I mean? Like really cool and really dynamic. An emote. So this is a little bit unique in that you get to do something with the character in the game, and it's really dependent on what the purpose of the emote is, right? At times, like it's a good moment for the character to break away, probably from like the constraints of gameplay, but also who they are as a character. Depending on the circumstances and depending on like the parameters that you're given around the particular emote, it can be a couple of different things, right? There's always emotes that you can fall back on that are either ability based or based off of the abilities that they use or something that they do in gameplay or something that's relative to their personality. But there are times at which like you can break away from that if like the brief or like the if the purpose calls for it. Cutscenes and cinematics. So this is probably the biggest departure from anything that you would see in a game, and it's serves the same purpose as like any film or like TV show or anything like that would be. It's to tell the story, right? You don't have to worry so much about making sure you fulfill maybe the promise of gameplay or making sure they are showing off in a really dynamic way and making you, the player that's piloting the character, feel really like empowered. The bigger purpose of all of the cutscenes and cinematics, whether they're RTC, IGC, or pre-rendered, is to tell the story. Okay, so I wanted to go over particularly what we'll be doing in this workshop. So what we'll be doing in this workshop together is a character intro. And so there's a couple of things to keep in mind. So first of all, the purpose of our character intro is to show off the character in a dynamic moment. So if you're familiar with Overwatch, it's a highlight intro, right? The kind of performance that you get as a play of the game. That's basically what we'll be doing. Those kinds of performances are sometimes used in other purposes and like for other things, like whether it's for a lobby or whether it's for like a trailer of some sort. Like those that asset can be reused for a couple of different things, but the purpose is still the same, right? To be able to show off the character in a dynamic moment, and that's what we'll be doing. And there's a very unique restriction in this, in that this character moment, the character intro, is going to be in game, but it's not for gameplay. So that offers us and puts on us a very unique set of restrictions, right? We don't necessarily have to worry about certain things that we would have to worry about, whether it was in firing in game or not, or like during gameplay, but it is still playing in engine, right? So there are a couple of things that we have to keep in mind, and we'll go over those things more in depth once we begin to actually go through and create the character intro. And so it's important to kind of put context around all of this. And so what I'm proposing for the game that this character intro is going to be for, right? Just setting some parameters. It's going to be for a PvP hero shooter. Okay. Where I expect it to play. So if you're thinking about the game flow of it, it will either play or happen before or after a game recap. So whether it's at the end of a match or whether you're looking back at a highlight of like your previous matches, this is the one that will play, or this piece of animation will play, this character moment. The character I decided to use is Spider-Man. So I've just downloaded the Spider-Man rig off of the assets section of the Agora website, and it's game ready. And we'll get into more of that later once I get into mine, once we get into Unreal. So the things I want to make sure that I'm showing off is their mobility and their abilities. So for this PvP hero shooter, I'm less concerned about in this character moment, right? I don't have to think about things that too in depth, like whether it's a 1P game or whether it's like a 3P game, right? For this character moment, none of that necessarily matters, right? All that really matters is making sure that we have a dynamic moment for the character. And so I want to make sure that I'm selling a little bit of the hero fantasy, and also like a little bit of like the promise of gameplay, right? So if you think about Spider-Man and like the way that he would move and like who he is as a character, right? The two things that kind of stand out the most about him are his mobility and his abilities, being like any kind of web abilities, right? And then the biggest restriction that I'd like us to practice. So this part in particular, you don't necessarily have to do if you don't want, but we will be going over it a little bit, and it's, I think, a good restriction to kind of work around. It'll kind of get you into good practice, and it'll, I think, open up your eyes a lot into how your asset or how your animation is actually being treated and how it's being played, and like other things that you can kind of do and compensate for that. So we'll be using Unreal Engine for this, and we'll be making just a very, very simple sequence, which we'll be doing together. So, don't worry about that if you don't have too much familiarity with Unreal Engine. It's very there are resources that I will be leveraging already, that it's on the Agora website. And it can be daunting, but it's not as difficult as it seems, I promise. Okay, so the exercise that I'd like to ask of you all. So I'd like you all to come up with your own unique game character, right? So kind of define the parameters of the game, right? Like what kind of game is it? And kind of define the parameters of the character. So who is my character and what do they do? In my example, right, I'm using Spider-Man, and he's pretty well known, and so it's a little bit easier in my on my part. And so think about like what they would be like in gameplay, like what would be their signatures, right? A little bit like how I highlighted that Spider-Man is all about his mobility and his abilities, like his web. And the last but not least, and this one's probably way more important than you might think, the character rig and its limitations. So if you decide to walk through this, the Unreal portion of the exercise, it's important that you use a rig that's game ready, right? There are a couple of things that denote whether the asset is game ready or not. But when you go through and you look through all of the resources and all of the assets that you can try and find for yourself, try and make sure that there's somewhere that in the description that says it's game ready. Okay. Whether it says it's game ready or not, sometimes it can be a little bit misleading. The biggest thing you want to make sure you look for, I'll try and I'll call it out again once we jump into Maya, but really quickly, you want to try and make sure that the skeleton hierarchy is all intact. So there's no broken rig, or there's no floating joints or anything like that. And you want to make sure the mesh is skin modified. There's a skin modifier, and it's bound to the skeleton and not constrained in any way, like you would expect of maybe like a robot or something like that. Okay, so amongst all of these different character moments, I'd like to take a sec to kind of specify some of the different technical restrictions there are around each of these. So the hero select, the character intro, the emote, the real-time cutscene, all of these different character moments have different restrictions around them. And so like a good example would be the camera, right? For a hero select, you're pretty much locked into the one camera that you've got whenever you queue into the screen. So the camera is no longer a character, right? It just doesn't move. The character will perform to the camera. In a character intro, it's a little bit more flexible, where you're able to control the camera a little bit closer to like linear media or shot work, and it can become a character. And as I'm sure you're all of you are aware, it plays a very significant role in when creating dynamic poses. When creating a dynamic pose, the camera is half the battle. And so if you don't have the camera at your disposal, it then becomes a little bit more challenging to create a dynamic pose, right? For an emote, that one's a little bit specific too, right? The camera isn't necessarily a character, but it's also not necessarily locked. Normally, when these things fire off in gameplay, you're able to orbit the camera around the character. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that your animation is going to be viewed from any one optimal viewing point, right? It's almost impossible to be able to predict or kind of curate a performance to a certain kind of camera in an emote. So therefore, you shouldn't, but you should try and abide by more traditional dynamic posing rules, and not necessary just to a camera. So in a real-time cutscene, that's going to be a little dependent on the game, right? So if we're talking about a game like God of War, there is going to be a set camera. It may move during the real-time cutscene. You don't necessarily have control over it per se, not like you would like in a character intro or in a cinematic. But it is something that's not necessarily locked like it is in the character select or hero select. But it's not necessarily something that's kind of free roaming like it is in an emote. Okay. And in in-game cinematics and pre-rendered cinematics, you can almost think of those as like shot cameras. So those are probably the safest places where you could animate to the character or to the camera. And so like aside from the camera, right, with a lot of these needing to be rendered out of the engine or work in the engine, there are a couple of things like to keep in mind. And so they're not necessarily pertinent to our workshop, but I'd like to at least include it. That way you guys have some kind of wherewithal of like the types of restrictions you could foresee. So in a hero select, a character intro, an emote, a real-time cutscene, and in an in-game cinematic, right? You're pretty much bound to using the game rig, the rig that's basically being used for gameplay. And those rigs in particular have a lot more restrictions around them. Whereas if you work on a pre-rendered cinematic, you're able to use a different version of the rig, albeit it could be the same model, most likely is, if not up-res a little bit more. But the rig can be a lot more flexible. You're able to cheat a lot more, right? Because it's pre-rendered, whereas like everything else is basically running it real time to an extent. And so there's a lot less allowance for cheating. So like whether you have like space switching over a frame, that may or may not work, depending on like how your frames are interpolating, or if they're compressed or not. I won't get into those too much, but it is something I would like to call out. That way you guys have knowledge of it. Okay, so that was pretty much the lecture. We're going to jump into Maya a little bit. I'll show you guys a little bit of the rig, how I've modified it a little bit for my purposes, how I like to set up my rig, and have fun creating your character intro and your unique character.